Hello, everyone. My name is Sharila Stepan, and I'm the Communications and Creative Manager at Born This Way Foundation. Our mission is to support the mental health of young people everywhere and work alongside them to build a kinder and braver world. It's the ideas and perspectives of young people that ground our work every day. And we understand that climate change is causing distress, anger, and other emotions in young people worldwide. And we want to make sure that we're addressing this and working with young people and our partners to do so. Through this discussion and across our platforms, we aim to elevate their voices, create a space to support their mental health with appropriate resources, as well as address the environmental need for climate justice so that we can address climate change with intention, purpose, justice, and visibility. That's why I am extremely excited to be speaking with Aisha and Sarah about the global effects of climate change and their efforts for climate conservation. So I'd love to invite each of you to please introduce yourselves, your pronouns, and the intention that you're bringing into today's conversation.
Hi, thank you for having me. My name is Aisha Anyata Brown. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And I am a recent graduate from George Mason University and a social justice, climate justice activist. And today, the intention that I'm bringing to the conversation is the intention of hope, openness, and general understanding of like respecting people and meeting them where they are in this conversation.
Hi, and thanks everyone for coming. My name is Sarah Jaquette Ray, and I'm a professor and chair of environmental studies at Cal Poly Humboldt in Arcata, California, which is unceded Wiyot territory. And you might hear some beautiful environmental sounds behind me, and I really honor and appreciate the millennium of work that the Wiyot and other tribes in this area have done to make this environment so rich and wonderful to live in, and ongoing work that they're doing. And the work I'm trying to do too, with the intention of, and Aisha said it, my word too, I love that we're in the same intention space of openness, which is, I love that as my intention for today. I feel openness about this because I love the format of a conversation. So thanks for organizing it.
Of course, we are so grateful and honored to have you both. And I'd love to stay with you, Sarah. You wrote a book, and within it, it includes a section, a portion, your book titled A Field Guide to Climate Change. And within it, you say, as climate disruption exacerbates existing structural oppression, such as racism, sexism, economic injustice, we need to combat these structures in our daily lives. And I'd love to hear about some daily practices that we can start today.
Yeah, thanks for bringing up the book. A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety was a response to seeing my students feel really disempowered, and what I learned later in the research on the topic, a phenomenon called pseudo inefficacy, which is the feeling we have that when a problem is so big that we feel like we can't solve it because we're so small, we don't even try. We don't even begin to take the first step. And when I had done all of this work in my own personal life and in my academic life of critiquing structures of oppression, critiquing structures of problems, systems thinking, systems theory, and this really big swing from coming really from justice orientations against thinking of the problems as rooted as in individuals, right? The problems are not individuals, and all this sort of work that you can do as an individual is a drop in the bucket compared to the pollution and problems that corporations are producing, and the role that they play in our climate justice problems. And so I had really swung against the individual as a field of play for climate action and social justice action. And I think that was a mistake. And when I realized that the effect of that swing was that my students felt like they had no role to play, no power to play, nothing that they could do to address the climate problem because it was only structures, and they didn't feel like they were part of those structures. That this left students and myself, many of us, feeling very disempowered and very hopeless as a result. And so I started to realize that the sense of empowerment that we need to feel was critical to the climate action that needed to happen. And so how is it that we can make the problem bigger and the problem smaller, excuse me, and us bigger as we try to address this? And the number one way to make ourselves bigger is to connect to community, to find your purpose by finding your people. And that's a real critique or rejection of the way individualism tells us that we're the only things that exist on the planet, and that our actions are in themselves isolated in little bubbles by themselves. But to see ourselves as part of what Paul Hawking calls a blessed unrest, or what Adrienne Maree Brown calls the emergence. And so I really love this notion that for Adrienne Maree Brown, small is all. What we are as individuals, what we can do as individuals, is all we can actually do. And that we never are any bigger than that or any smaller than that. And we can't, it's hypocritical to say that we are pervasively complicit in all of these problems that ripple out across the globe just because we're Americans impacting the world as individuals so hugely. And then also say that we have no power as we walk through the world to reduce the harm that we're doing. And so this turn towards the individual, not individualism, but to the individual as having a role within a collective, is something that I've really tried to explore in the book, and that I really try to make the case when I talk to audiences. And for myself, I need to feel like I matter. I feel like if we don't feel like we have some control over the conditions of reality in our lives, we will do what's called depression and anxiety and nihilism in mental health language. That is the definition of depression to some people. And so what I see as a way to combat in our daily practices that sort of nihilism. We just saw another climate suicide on Friday with Wynn Bruce. We see that kind of nihilism happening in young people, especially, which is indicated by the fact that 1 in 4 young people doesn't want to have a child because they don't want to bring a child into an uninhabitable planet. Right. So the practices that we need to do have to happen on an individual scale. And we do have an ability to make an impact. That's all we have, as Adrienne Maree Brown would say.
I think that's really interesting, Sarah, because community is so important. I see it as like our communities, as individual communities, is our collective earth. So when you really root down into your own community and find that strength within your own community, and people do that across their communities, across the world, that's really where all the power is. So I really resonate with what you're saying. And thank you for sharing that. I'm just like blown away by that.
I'm equally as impacted by your words, Sarah, and your work, and yours as well, Aisha. I know that you yourself have spoken so candidly about the added element of racial justice and your experiences and neurodiversity as it relates to eco-anxiety and the concept of focusing on the individual, of sharing our experiences, of creating a safe space where young people can express themselves and really share resources and hope so that we can combat these feelings is something that the foundation, and I know that both of you do every day in your work. And Aisha, I'd love to hear more about that, about your experiences in speaking so candidly about these issues and some of the resources that you turn to for support.
Yeah, so I think when it comes to any sort of justice issue, when it comes to eco anxiety, climate justice, neurodiversity, each person in any group of people, community, thinks completely differently about a topic via perspective, right? So it's really important to take that into consideration when we're talking about issues like eco anxiety, because when we're talking about any sort of mental health, we have to take into consideration that person's background. Are they neurodiverse? Are they, allistic or autistic? What is their racial background? What kinds of things are their culture sort of contributing to that element of anxiety that they're facing when it comes to the climate crisis? And so when it comes to where I find sort of that space of like what resources I turn to, it really comes down to, again, going back to community. And there are several ways that you can find community and that I find community. One is being in an online space where you're kind of like ultra connected with lots of people in lots of different places. And another is finding like-minded individuals in my own community, whether I'm rooted down in my hometown or whether that's where I went to school or wherever I'm taken in this world. It's really important to find those like-minded people, because those conversations and those people in those communities are your resource. That's how you help yourself to help the world. And it's just this entirely different experience. And if you're having, something like an entirely different experience, whether it's because you're neurodivergent or you're of a different cultural background, if you share those experiences, somebody else who may have been like, wait, am I having the same experience? They can relate back to you and be like, okay, so this is real, this is happening. And it starts a conversation. And I think particularly the app TikTok is really good at that. You learn so much and find so much community on that app. And so those are some of the different resources that I go to for support in those different elements.
You're muted, Shadil.
Yes, I am. Here we are. I wanted to thank you so much, Aisha. I know that you are a source of support and that you create these spaces as well. And through your own advocacy efforts and also through your work at the Climate Mental Health Network, you place a lot of these topics and perspectives and resources at the forefront of what you do every day. And we're so grateful for that community that you've fostered. And at the foundation, we also have a space. It's called Channel Kindness, and it's a storytelling platform where we invite young people of all ages and youth advocates to share about their experiences and the acts of kindness and the resources and the organization that exist in their communities. And so to anyone who's interested in sharing their story and to having an additional space to share about the work that they're doing and to inspire others, please feel free to check out channelkindness.org. We are so excited to feature Aisha's voice on the platform as well very soon. And I'd love to turn back to Sarah. Sarah, you know the importance of acknowledging the complex climate emotions that young people are experiencing today. And I know your book dives heavily deep into that topic. And I'd love to hear from the conversations you've had with your students, from the resources that you were connected to. What are some ways that young people can practice mindfulness and self-care and find that space and feel the comfort of expressing themselves to both honor their feelings of hope and grief for the future?
Yeah, this is a big question, and it has multiple layers of answers for me. One is that in the activist spaces of most of the students that I worked with, and it turned out in the middle of writing the book, I saw the youth climate movement kick off and realized that it wasn't just my students, it was this huge population. And then the more research that's been done, including the Lancet article that many of my great mental health colleagues have produced out of the Lancet journal with 10,000 young people aged 16 to 25, and the reports about the prevalence of climate anxiety in that generation really testifies to the fact that this is a huge thing that's happening. And I really am sort of overwhelmed at the both dread and sadness that I feel with this generation, and also hope and optimism. One of the things that I think that the vast majority, especially of Americans in sort of an American context or Western context, that we need to really combat, that a lot of psychologists understand and people who do have experience in mindfulness understand, is that there's a real against the grain that we need to fight against here. Mainstream culture makes us think that if we're feeling negative or so-called negative but uncomfortable feelings like anguish or dread or anxiety, that there's something wrong with us personally, individually. And we pathologize it into the sort of therapeutic private sphere and stigmatize it as a real problem. And this, of course, is uneven across race and gender and class. So the notion of even talking about mental health as a topic, much less around climate change, that are already itself is available to, or a set of responses is available to, oftentimes a very specific set of people. And so I want to really bring up what Aisha mentioned about positionality, about our perspective. Perspective dictates what emotions are available to us, and also the culture in which we can seek resources for that, or whether or not even we want to politicize those emotions. And I think what's really important for us to think about is that our despair and grief and feelings of anguish or feelings of shame around wanting to have children or not wanting to have children in this context. I was just talking to somebody yesterday who broke into tears visualizing a future where he was able to, where he had children and already having decided he wasn't going to have children. And so that grief that comes along with that decision and the shame to even talk about it among many activists, all of these sort of negative emotions have an actual space in the political conversation, and they ought to be leveraged and collectivized to make changes at the political level. That's what's happening with that research that came out of the Lancet. The people who are using that to go create laws in the courts of human rights law around moral injury, that's bringing emotions to a whole new public level, political level. And I agree with Glenn Albrecht and many people who study the use of emotions for changing culture and changing politics. Affect theorists, for example, racial justice movement leaders, they're always been using emotions to make the argument. Anger is a very, very important emotion for political change, and it's righteous, right? The reason we feel these so-called negative emotions is for good reason. It's a response, as Britt Ray says, it's just a sign that you're connected to the world, right? You're connected to reality, that you're so upset and that you're having anxiety and trauma about oppression you're experiencing or climate traumas that you're experiencing. It's just a sign you're connected. So what do we do with that? The practices that we do with that, I used to feel like, and I think many of my students feel, and young people often feel, like they will be able to enjoy life, take the time for mindfulness, smell the flowers, whatever it is, that those privileges and those luxuries, they'll be able to enjoy them after the revolution, after it's all done, after they've worked their butts off day in and day out in this peak moment of urgency. We only have 10 years, right? This kind of urgency mode of the climate justice movement has meant that especially young people think, okay, this is the movement of my lifetime. Let's burn it out now while the time is urgent. And then when we've reached utopia, when climate change has been mitigated, when we have arrived at justice, then we can rest. But this is capitalism showing up in our activism, right? This is productivism showing up in the way we do our work against capitalism. That's not resistance, right? So like Tricia Hersey, the Nap Bishop, so beautifully says, rest is a form of resistance, right? We absolutely need to protect precious interior resources of our mental and physical health in order to stay in this fight for the long haul. It's not going to just be done in 10 years or 5 years. This is the work of our lives. So if it's long term and we care about this for the long term, and our mission is to address climate justice for our lives, we utterly, absolutely must protect our well-being in order to do that work. Our well-being is our capacity, right? And so how do we do that? We start literally with a breath. So this is where mindfulness does come in. I often think people reject mindfulness because maybe it's too slow or too personal. But really, truly, the core of mindfulness, especially the roots in Buddhism and socially engaged Buddhism, comes from this desire to use everything you can in service of the world. And if it's not in service of the world, then it's not mindfulness, in my opinion. And also, if we're in service to the world in a way that doesn't refuel us, then we're only depleting our resources, which the planet doesn't need us to do. We can't afford to be depleted. The planet needs us to be fully resourced.
And I'd love to hear about, thank you so much, Sarah. I think there's definitely a lot to unpack in what you just shared, and that can be an entire conversation in its own, certainly. And we want to really use a lot of what you said about just leaning into what you shared with the report, that while so many young people did report feeling sad, angry, anxious, and afraid, there is a lot of optimism and a lot of sense of ownership over the ability to do something and to create change within this space. And we know that young people are doing it already. There are so many youth advocates that we can name and that we can lean on to really help us understand what this looks like and the full scope of emotions that we feel, and sort of together navigate that. We're definitely not alone in these feelings, and knowing that we have young people like Aisha and and so many others, like the Gen Z board at the Climate Action, excuse me, the Climate Mental Health Network. We're we're really getting to understand their perspectives and lean into these stories of hope and aspiration as well. And as you shared, really taking that moment to breathe. I think when you said the word "take a breather," I really just like inhaled deeply and exhaled. And I hope everyone who's watching feels the same, that we can do this, and that while there is this heavy weight of what we're talking about, there's no doubt that climate anxiety and climate change and these topics are heavy, but that we can navigate these emotions together. And so I'd love to hear, just on that note, I'd love to hear, Aisha, if you, we know that there are young people tuning in that want to make this difference. They're looking at you, and they're connecting to the words that you and Sarah are sharing, and we're thinking if there's a chance for them to participate and to get connected to this type of work, what would you say to them about how they can get started in advocacy?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different ways to get connected in the advocacy space. And I guess it's all about like how your drive is, how your passion is, how your energy levels are too, because it takes a lot of energy. And you do have to rest, like Sarah was saying. So for me, I guess just to share from my perspective and sort of how I got into the space was, I was interested in geography as a, middle school, high schooler, and there was this cool opportunity that one of my teachers shared, and I was able to go to South Africa and study through a pilot program, geospatial technologies and climate change. And from that, it just got me thinking, like, oh, look at all these different intersections. Came from a background of art and music and all of these different things. And I was like, well, what if I combine that? Because if you think about music, you think about the spirit of art. It is this vibration that sort of aligns with the energy of Earth. And if that's something that keeps us alive and keeps us moving, wouldn't that make sense for it to be a great motivator for the Earth and for nature and things of that nature? So I sort of like kept that in mind as I sort of went down this path of activism and advocacy. There's a lot of spaces online and on different apps like Instagram, TikTok, things of that nature. There are great movements like Sunrise you can get in contact with, Zero Hour. There's lots of different spaces and organizations that you can get involved with, but there's also the space that you hold personally as your own climate literacy begins and develops, where you can create your own space on the internet and you can use your own voice, but you also can root down in your community in person and bring together those voices as well. I know for me that I'm from a more rural area, and there are plenty of activists and advocates that are doing the work and that are, I'm from Appalachia, so fighting that pipeline, and they are using art. It's Artivism Virginia, and they're using art and music and all of these different things to bring community together to spread their message. And that's a way to root down into your own community. Not every activism and advocate has to be so public facing, because sometimes social media in that space can be really intimidating and can also feel like a lot of pressure, because literally anybody can see you. You've got a lot of eyes watching you. So especially if you're, in high school or the beginning stages of college, I would say find your community in person. And if you feel so compelled to, whatever group that you're a part of, you can take it online and you can get more people involved, and you can think about those intersections where it's not just doom and gloom and, this tremendous weight of like sadness. It is hopeful, and it's not that we have this definitive endpoint. Like Sarah was saying, it's a lifetime of work, it's a lifetime of energy, and you have to make sure that you're resting, you have to make sure that you're living and bringing hope to life, not just your own life, but to others and to the earth. And so, community is really, really that way of doing that. And I think that also sustains your mental health when you have a group of people who are intersecting climate change and music or art or acting or dancing or singing in these really, really wonderful ways. So like I said before, it's really just, you can start anywhere and you can intersect basically anything, because climate change is this big umbrella that's over us that sort of encompasses everything. So you could bring anything, everything into it and make it work. And there are people that are going to resonate with that. So I would say start with what you're passionate about, climate change and whatever else you may be feeling, and bring that into the space, because we need everybody's voices, every community, and that's where I would say to start.
Can I add on something to Aisha's beautiful points? I love what you're saying, because I think a lot of young people think that they have to have a very limited notion of power to be able to do something, like a very particular degree or money or political position, and otherwise they have no power. And I think the climate movement, especially with Generation Z, the Generation Z has brought itself to the climate movement, reconfigured the climate movement, has redefined what counts as a climate job or a climate vocation or a climate calling, to really center whatever their passion is and bring that the imagination around what's possible that is outside of those existing or traditional forms, domains of power, has been really fun to watch Gen Z do with climate movement. Everything is happening just like you just described, Aisha. I also just want to add really quickly that the grief and the despair, and this is where mental health experts can tell you about this, the grief and despair is about something that we love, about something that we feel we're connected to, that we're worried about rupturing or changing or losing. And so most of the climate movement is about getting organized to stave off something that we fear or dread. Whereas I really think we ought to reframe, as Aisha just beautifully did, reframe the climate movement about what we have passion around, what do we love that we want to protect. And once you answer that question, what do I love around me that I'm afraid is under threat because of climate change? Why don't I start focusing on whatever I can do to nurture that thing, to foster the thriving of that thing? And that can be anytime you take any kind of step to attend to your relationship with something, build the ties of that relationship, nurture the well-being of the things that you love, you are building resilience in it to deal with climate change. And that is a climate action. And so we really broaden our idea of where the field of action is for climate action, and really focus pleasure and love and desire, a lot more carrot, a lot less stick around the way we move into and arrive and show up into the world. We're going to be fueled by it, and it will be a long-term resource for our work.
I love that, and I love the analogy you chose. It's uh, both excellent points, and we're so grateful that you've both joined us for this conversation, that we get to lean into this topic. And as we discuss these issues, they can feel overwhelming for folks. And we want to remind everyone that you're not alone, and that the resources for support are available. And you can find a global directory of mental health resources at bekind.findahelpline.com, and you can learn how to kindly and safely support the mental health of your loved ones and yourself at BeThereCertificate.org. It's a free online mental health course available in English, French, and Spanish. And so these are, in addition to the resources that Aisha mentioned, the accounts that we can follow, the people that lead us in this space, and as Sarah mentioned, the mental health professionals that are helping to equip themselves with the knowledge around climate action and climate change, as Aisha mentioned, climate literacy overall, and to know that there are organizations like the Climate Mental Health Network that is ensuring that these resources are being captured and shared in ways that feel relatable and that helps support young people is important to Born This Way Foundation. And I'm grateful to share this platform with you both and to amplify these resources alongside you. And I do have just one last question for our conversation, which feels like can last hours. Honestly, I'd love to hear more and continue to amplify both of your voices in any way that we can. In this particular moment, I'd love to ask and to also invite those who are watching to share what their response to this question is. We want this to be an interactive space. What is one act or practice in your daily routine that that sort of keeps you balanced and grounded, that is non-negotiable? I'd love to kick it over to Aisha to kick us off.
Yeah, I love this question. So yeah, like I said at the beginning of this conversation, I recently graduated, so I've had some time off, sort of looking for a job, but it's always been naps. I love, like we were talking about rest and sleep. You can find me taking a nap really anywhere. That's how I kind of keep balanced is. And also like I'm a very like visual person, and I think that carries over into my rest. So I dream a lot, and that keeps me balanced is my dreams are most of the time very beautiful. And so when I wake up, I have this like twinkle in my eye. I'm like, oh wow, look at what I can do. And my dreams make me feel powerful. My rest makes me feel powerful. So that's like the main thing for me. Um, Also, I have like a jar of like positive affirmations that if I'm feeling a little down, I just kind of reach in. I'm like, hey, I had my mom and grandma and other people write them for me, and just reminders that, I'm surrounded by love and there's positivity in this world. So probably those two things in that order.
Oh, thank you so
Oh,
much for sharing that. And if it's okay with you, Aisha, is there an affirmation you want to share with those of us who are watching and with Sarah and I,
From my jar?
if you'd like?
Okay, I don't know what all of them say. Let's see. Here's one. Um, oh, it says, I value your judgment, and it's from my mom.
oh my God.
Oh, well, thank you so much for sharing that with us.
Of course.
I'm doing that. I have to make one of those. Oh, I'm really touched by that, Aisha. I just love that jar. Oh my gosh, I'm doing one of those myself. Oh, I have probably several, and depends on the day of the action, but I'm getting one of those jars, so that's on my list. That is a climate action, to have yourself a jar. So do that tomorrow. That's something you can do right now. I'm always collecting these lists of what are climate actions that we wouldn't think of as climate actions. Celebrating yourself that way, that's so wonderful. My number one thing that I find is my lifeline is just simply a sort of what would be called a strategic question that helps me counterbalance the despair, the heaviness of every day. And this is a question that I learned from one of my mindfulness teachers, Heidi Bourne, and she probably learned it from one of her teachers, that kind of thing. But whenever we're feeling really big despair about everything that's going on, which we have, of course, new levels of access to with the way media has developed in the last 50 years, I always ask myself, what else is true? And the what else is true question takes me away from the reality that I know intellectually that I have a negativity bias in my brain, as we all do. It's reptilian. And I know that the media feeds that. I know that the media feeds that because we give it our eyeballs. And so therefore it makes that media produce more of that bad stuff. And so it's not that those things that are represented in dominant media and in my doom scrolling feed aren't true. It's just that they're only one particular story of what's true. And asking myself what else is true opens up my mind, my imagination. I wish I had it in my dream life like Aisha, but it opens up my imagination to say, what else is right in front of me that's beautiful? What is going well? What doesn't hurt? Where is the thriving? Oh, it's right here. It's right here. Oh, these things are all still beautiful and thriving and not painful and not suffering. And that lifts me up. And so when I talk about this carrot versus stick idea, this is really something I again got from Adrienne Marie Brown. She says, feed what you want to grow. When we pay attention to the doom scrolling, we actually feed that stuff. We make it bigger in our own minds, if not in reality. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So what we pay attention to grows. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. That is the intensity of the power of our minds, as Aisha's dream life just stated. It's a beautiful illustration of it. So what else is true is my practice every day. Yeah.
Oh, thank you both. I really love it. Feed what you want to grow, and in a world where we are constantly fed and sort of shared what can feel like overwhelming amounts of information about climate change or any of the other injustices that we're all focusing on and really sort of having all even in talking about it. This is how I feel sometimes about the information that runs and the amount of thoughts that are coming through at once. And it's so important to rest. Thank you, Aisha, for that reminder. And it's such a beautiful thing to lean into both of your words, into the beautiful birds chirping in your background, Sarah. This conversation has been incredibly grounding, and it is a small seed of what we can do and what we can start to nurture is have these types of conversations with each other and with our loved ones, and really lean into these topics in spaces that make us feel safe. And so with that, I want to thank you both so much for joining us, for starting this conversation with Born This Way Foundation. And for anyone else who's interested in learning more about our work, please visit bornthisway.foundation. And throughout the conversation, we shared a lot of beautiful links and resources to some of the topics that we talked about, and we want to make sure that folks feel welcome to lean into those as well. And so, on that note, I just want to thank you all again for joining us. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Aisha, and we will talk very soon. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.